With the capture of Monterrey, America had made its first deep cuts into Mexico itself. However, America's greatest successes would actually be found far to the west as it seized New Mexico and California from its enemies. When we last left events in the west, Captain John Fremont and Captain Robert Stockton had taken effective control of California after a mess of miscommunication and miraculous timing. In this video, we will see how that control was challenged and how the US also seized New Mexico and the fighting that resulted in America's final victory to claim the West for itself. Taking territory in the West had always been a goal for the war. President James Polk had decided early on to send Colonel Stephen Carney to seize New Mexico before linking up with Fremont and the US Pacific Squadron to take California. They could not know that Fremont and Stockton would already be in control by the time Carney arrived. First, however, Carney would have to contend with New Mexico. New Mexico was a priority target for obvious geographic reasons, given its location. Mexico's grip on the territory was also weak and ineffective. With a very high number of American settlers in the territory and extensive trade links between the new Mexican capital at Santa Fe and American cities, especially St. Louis, Washington expected that New Mexico would not much resist a US takeover. Carney was given orders to gather a force of around 1,500 men and advance upon Santa Fe. They were not expected to encounter resistance. Sending a force of the Missouri Volunteers ahead under Colonel Alexander Doniphan, Carney followed a few days later, keeping his forces spread out to ensure they wouldn't deplete food and water along the route. It was a sensible precaution, since the trek from the starting point in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas to their rendezvous at Bent Fort in New Mexico was over 500 miles of rough terrain. The first leg was arid, dry country in the middle of summer, followed by a long trek along the Santa Fe Trail used by merchant caravans. Carney's men were composed largely of volunteers who were not used to such marches, and the expedition was tough on them. The US sent merchants ahead and leaned on their connections in New Mexico to advise sympathetic New Mexicans of the annexation ahead of time. Most New Mexicans accepted word of Carney's imminent arrival with either indifference or mild support. They had no interest in fighting for the Mexican government. Nevertheless, reports indicated that Governor Manuel Armijo had gathered up about 2,000 men and was setting up a defensive position a few miles north of Santa Fe. Carney linked up with Doniphan at Bent's Fort and pressed onwards anyway. Although the prospect of facing a numerically superior force in a defensive position after a long march across rough country with an inexperienced army did not inspire optimism among many of his men. Unfortunately for the governor, the original American predictions of the New Mexicans' mood had proven correct. When Governor Armijo gathered up his war council on August 16th in anticipation of Carney's arrival, he found almost all of his officers didn't want to fight. They reported that their men were no more enthusiastic about it either. There was such a total lack of will that Governor Armijo simply disbanded his army on the spot and left with his bodyguard for the Mexican city of Chihuahua instead. This video is a paid partnership with BetterHelp. Life doesn't always turn out the way we expect. Sometimes a big change like graduating or starting a new career brought challenges and made me think more about mental health. Therapy can play an important role by connecting us with someone who listens, guides the conversation with thoughtful questions, and offers new perspectives, as well as practical tools to support positive change. BetterHelp is on a mission to make starting therapy easier. If the first match doesn't feel right, you can switch therapists anytime at no extra cost. BetterHelp has more than 7,000 reviews and holds a 4.3 rating on Trustpilot, showing it's a platform people trust. It's flexible, convenient, and designed to fit into your life. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/Knowledgeia to get 10% off your first month of therapy. Taking that first step can make all the difference. 2 days later, Carney's men rode into Santa Fe with music and laughter, declaring New Mexico to now be territory of the United States. Much like the initial seizure of California, the New Mexico campaign had been completed without either side firing a shot. Carney, now promoted to brigadier general, spent the next month establishing a temporary military government for the territory. Technically, he had no such authority to do so, but practically won out. He appointed a prominent American merchant, Charles Bent, to act as civilian governor, while one of his subordinates, Colonel Sterling Price, would remain in military command. The main challenges were potential anti-American rebellions and a decades-old problem with Indian raiders, mainly Navajo, who had to be dealt with. Carney had also promised to send excess troops south for a planned march on the city of Chihuahua. To fit both goals, he ordered Colonel Donovan to remain in New Mexico until the Indian problem was dealt with, before proceeding south to join with a detachment of Taylor's men being sent against Chihuahua. With those arrangements made, Carney departed for California in late September. Carney was still en route in early October when he finally received word that Commodore Stockton and Captain Fremont had taken control of California already. A welcome surprise, Carney decided to send most of his men back to Santa Fe to help deal with the Indians or join Donovan's expedition, while keeping just 100 of his men to continue on to California, which they did not reach until late November. Even then, the final few hundreds miles through the California desert were miserable, and it was a small, haggard, and weary force who emerged on the far side of the desert into US-controlled territory in early December. But all was not what it seemed. Stockton and Fremont had been quick to declare California under their control after Governor Castro's departure in August 1847. They quickly set about organizing their piecemeal forces into a California battalion and, much like Carney in New Mexico, lay the foundations for a civilian government that they had no actual authority to create. Stockton insisted that a government was needed to quickly assert control of the territory, or else it might fall into chaos. His concerns were not unjustified. The Mexican Californios living in the newly conquered territory did not appreciate their new occupiers. This discontent boiled over in Los Angeles in September when Californian natives rose up against the U.S. garrison there under Captain Archibald Gillespie. Several hundred pro-Mexican rebels, led by Jose Maria Flores, lay siege to Gillespie and his few dozen men, who surrendered to the rebels on September 30th. The rebels made them hand over their heavier munitions and ran them out of town. By October, these rebels had control of all of Southern California. Stockton sent a force of several hundred infantry to retake the city, but it was obvious that naval rank did not translate to good leadership on land. Stockton failed to properly provision the men he sent and failed to anticipate that the rebels had captured Gillespie's artillery. The American force walked right into captured artillery, which sent them retreating from Los Angeles with their tails between their legs. Humbled, the Americans prepared a more serious expedition. Fremont managed to scrape together 400 volunteers as Stockton relocated his headquarters to San Diego to command more effectively. It was in the midst of these preparations that word of Carney's arrival in California reached Stockton. He dispatched Captain Gillespie to meet him, and the two forces linked up on December 5th with plans to rejoin Stockton at San Diego. However, a group of 75 Californios under Captain Andres Pico had encamped between them and San Diego at the village of San Pascual. Carney and Gillespie, outnumbering the Californios 2-1, decided to launch a surprise attack on them on the morning of December 6th. Why Carney thought that his exhausted, depleted army were in any condition to fight after 2 months of travel is a mystery. Even if the men were in good enough condition, which they weren't, their horses were in an even worse state and were in no state to be ridden into battle. Meanwhile, Pico's forces consisted of well-rested men with fresh horses, many of whom were lancers who would have an innate advantage over the close-ranged, saber-wielding American cavalry. The sound of the approaching American horses at dawn on December 6th alerted Pico's men of the attack early enough for them to mount up. They met the American attack directly and turned the tide almost immediately. The American cavalry were no match for the Lancers, and only the hasty arrival of American artillery convinced the Californians to withdraw. The Battle of San Pascual left 18 Americans dead, while the Mexicans hadn't lost a man. To make matters worse, both Carney and Gillespie took serious lance wounds. Both would live, but both were put out of commission as they recovered. Nevertheless, Pico's withdrawal did open the way to San Diego. Harassed by Pico's men and slowed down by the wounded, Carney and Gillespie's forces finally reached the city on December 12th. Immediately, problems arose. Stockton was functionally in command of American territory in California. However, as commander of the Army of the West and the one with actual orders from Washington, Carney could also claim supremacy. The two men never agreed on who held the highest command, and the result was a friction between them that underpinned the rest of the California campaign. Then there was Fremont, the freewheeling explorer-turned-soldier who had gotten himself involved in the first place by flaunting orders. All three men saw themselves as entitled to current or future leadership in California, and their behavior for the rest of the campaign often frustrated each other. In late December, the Americans launched a two-pronged march south against the Californians. Fremont was sent ahead first, hoping to distract or outflank the enemy, while Stockton and Carney marched together. Flores and his rebels decided to confront Stockton and Carney's forces while sending a smaller detachment to handle Fremont. They chose a ford across the San Gabriel River as their first line of defense. Stockton and Carney reached the position on January 8th. The Californians commanded the high ground across the river with artillery to boot, but Stockton ordered his men into a square formation and advanced towards the river anyway. Flores tried but failed to break his formation before it reached the river, allowing the Americans to cross. Carney ordered the artillery to set up before covering the fording of the river, but Stockton countered him, ordering his men to rush across without cover. This saved time, but also exposed the men to greater risk and highlighted the competing personalities of the two commanders. The Americans managed to cross the river in a timely fashion, and when the artillery was finally ready, Stockton personally directed it against Californian positions. They managed to knock out all of the Californian guns, and Flores was unable to muster an effective counterattack. Once the Americans had gained a foothold across the river, it was over. The Battle of San Gabriel lasted just 90 minutes and cost only 2 dead and a dozen injured on either side, but laid open the American path to Los Angeles. Flores's men fell back, now down to just about 300 men, and made their last stand on an open plain just south of Los Angeles, known as Lamesa. The Battle of Lamesa opens the next day on January 9th. As had happened before, American artillery was decisive. The longer range and greater power of the American guns managed to drive the Californians from their positions before infantry was close enough to engage each other. The Californians attempted one final cavalry charge, but when it met a wall of American gunfire, they retreated, and the remaining rebels melted away. Again, casualties were remarkably low, with just 1 dead on either side. Stockton, Carney, and Gillespie marched into Los Angeles the following morning, where Gillespie was given the honor of raising the same flag in victory that he had lowered in surrender barely a year before. While the main force successfully retook Los Angeles, Fremont had continued his advance, and on January 11th, he received word of both the capture of Los Angeles and the presence of the last major band of rebels under Captain Andres Pico nearby. Recognizing that the rebel cause was doomed, or perhaps remembering that Pico had won one of the rebels' best victories against the Americans at San Pascual, Fremont sent a messenger ahead to negotiate an alternative to fighting. Fremont offered generous terms to the rebels, a total amnesty and the rights to return home in California or leave the country as they wished. By now, they'd heard of the capture of Los Angeles and must have known Mexican reinforcements were not coming. So Pico and the Californians gladly accepted the terms. The resulting Treaty of Cahuenga, signed on January 13th, brought the fighting in California to an end. The caveat, of course, was that Fremont had absolutely no authority to negotiate or offer terms of that nature. Fremont had committed his greatest act of insubordination yet, and given that he was well within easy communication distance with Stockton and Carney, it must have been intentional. When news reached Carney and Stockton, they were both furious. However, its acceptance by Pico and his men meant that they couldn't justifiably oppose it. They begrudgingly accepted the peace. With the fighting settled, Stockton, Carney, and Fremont now only had each other to contend with. Stockton was quick to assert himself as governor of California and issued orders to Fremont under that authority. Apparently biding his time for a later chance at control, Fremont accepted, throwing his support behind Stockton. Carney was less than pleased, but the very real risk of the dispute coming to blows convinced him to back down and await word from Washington. He informed Stockton of his decision in later January, writing he was, quote, "leaving with you the great responsibility of doing that for which you have no authority and preventing me from complying with the president's orders." The dispute proved short-lived, though. In the last week of January, reinforcements arrived from Washington with clear orders that Carney was to be appointed provisional governor of California. Stockton was sent home. Gillespie was relieved of his command and sent back to Washington, and Carney had Fremont brought up on charges of mutiny for his many acts of insubordination. But just as U.S. control of California was being secured, its control in New Mexico faced a violent challenge. U.S. control of New Mexico had been imposed quickly and with no consultation with the people already there. The large Hispano population and the Native Americans had no say in whether to join the United States after Carney had captured the territory. Just because the New Mexicans did not care for Mexican rule, that did not mean they passively accepted American rule instead. Many New Mexicans resented it, especially landowners, Catholic priests, and the native Pueblan Taos people, who all feared for their future under American control. It didn't take long for the plots to emerge. In December 1846, Governor Bent and Colonel Price uncovered a plot by Hispanos and Taos Pueblan natives to launch a revolt against their rule. The ringleaders were quickly arrested by Price, who naively believed that the danger had been averted. Governor Bent returned home to his family in Taos for Christmas in 1846, while Price remained in Santa Fe, both confident that they were safe. Unbeknownst to them, a group of Hispanos and Taos Pueblans, led by Pablo Montoya and Tomas Romero, had been planning another bolder revolt. On January 19, 1847, a group of several dozen rebels attacked Governor Bent at his home in Taos. They broke into his house, scalped him in front of his family, and then killed him. They proceeded to massacre a dozen other U.S. officials in Taos. The next day, they moved to the town of Arroyo Hondo, where they killed several more Americans, but not before some escaped to Santa Fe to fetch help. Within days, Colonel Price had gathered several hundred troops and marched out to suppress the Taos revolt. Price's men fought off several rebel ambushes before besieging the rest at the church at San Geronimo de Taos in Pueblo de Taos. For several days, his guns pelted the walls until he'd blown a hole large enough to open fire on the defenders within. About 150 rebels were killed, and most of their leadership, including Montoya and Romero, were captured. Romero was executed by an angry soldier the next day, while Montoya and 14 other leaders were executed on charges of treason. Given that Carney's governmental arrangements weren't even legal by US standards, the treason charge has been heavily criticized ever since. How could they unlawfully resist an authority that did not have a lawful basis in the first place? In the end, though, the legal technicalities didn't matter, and practical power decided affairs. Outbreaks of rebel activity continued for several more months, highlighting the insecurity of US control in newly captured territory. But by July, the last embers of the Taos Revolt had been stamped out. The Taos Revolt was a brief but violent interruption to an otherwise smooth series of successes for the war in the West. The US gains there proved to be the most valuable and impactful from the war. But at the time, the Western campaign was a sideshow. The real action was in Mexico itself, and Santa Anna was about to place the Americans on the back foot as he opened a new chapter of the war. If you'd like to help us keep creating and get early access to our videos, behind-the-scenes content, and other perks, consider becoming a member right here on YouTube or joining us on Patreon. Every bit of support helps. And as always, thank you so much for watching.